Paul and Paul, welcome to Volans. Paul Gilding, can you just say a little bit about who you are and then introduce the other Paul?
Sure. So I've been working in this area for 35 odd years, across both the NGO sector and the corporate sector. And a couple of years ago stopped doing that in order to focus on writing a book, which of course is what we're going to discuss today. And Paul Ferris worked with me on the book as a researcher, but also as a sort of provocateur for me in terms of my thinking, being involved in the youth climate movement. Recognising that he would have different perspectives, so provided an invaluable kind of sounding board in terms of the ideas.
Brilliant. And both of you now have done the book, The Great Disruption. So say a little bit more about that theme. And you were saying at one stage that you think an Austrian is going to wade in and save us to some degree. This isn't Arnie Schwarzenegger, it's Joseph Schumpeter. So where's all of that coming from?
It actually comes from my kind of background. Half my kind of activist career focused on NGO activism, the other half focused on business. And I think in that process learning what business is good and not good at, and likewise what NGOs are good and not good at. And I think I have become a big believer that markets, broadly defined, not the current financial markets as we see them, but the idea of markets, entrepreneurship, change, business, etc., has something very powerful to offer society once it's given the right kind of framework and logic. And in that context, Joseph Schumpeter, who's my kind of favourite economist, of course, the father of the idea of creative destruction, which I think we need a lot of. We need a lot of creative destruction, we need a lot of creativity and new ideas, we need a lot of destruction of the old economy. And that idea that we can kind of unleash that entrepreneurship and change in the market, given the right framework by government and the community, I think is a very powerful vehicle for change. And probably the only thing really that can drive, short of literal war, historically, that's the process that's driven the most change.
And in doing the book, you must have had both depressive moments. I mean, because the scale of the challenges you're talking about is horrendous in some ways. I mean, Paul, did you have moments where you felt suicidal?
Yeah. I mean, I have my down days and my up days, and thankfully, I mean, partly through writing the book and thinking through this, I do believe that we can rise to this moment, and there are huge opportunities and huge things ahead, which present really great opportunities for us as a species and as a planet. But there are down days, and that is part of the reality of working in this space. That you have to, on the one hand, recognise the vast potential for things to go wrong that we're facing, and yet at the same time, within that, the huge opportunity, the huge chance to actually get things right.
So say a little bit more, both of you, and perhaps Paul Gilding, a little bit more about where in the world you see the sorts of initiatives, new ventures that, in a sense, distill what you'd like to see many more people doing.
I think it's really broad. Is the key, is the essence of the idea, and that it's not just young social entrepreneurs. It's not just big corporates. It's not just interesting investors. It's all of that. And the essence of kind of the opportunity, I think, is that we have to recognise there isn't one true path through this. That we're going to need some really interesting entrepreneurial ideas, both social entrepreneurs and sort of more traditional commercial entrepreneurs with new technologies, new ideas and new business models. We are going to need some very big global companies to get on board in terms of their capital and change. And we are going to need some both some old school business models and some radically new business models. And I talk in the book about co-ops and different ways of doing it, and people kind of dismiss that as being so 70s kind of thing. In reality, co-ops employ more people than multinational companies do globally, which is a real surprise to us when we found that out. We kind of think of co-ops as being very much kind of a food co-op from the hippies of the 70s kind of thing. In actual fact, enormous institutions globally are cooperatives, and I'm not saying that's the answer. What I'm saying is that we need big global companies that are listed on stock exchanges, we need co-ops, we need entrepreneurs, we need all that to happen. And I think it's all happening. That the interesting thing is it's not like we need to invent all this stuff. There is some amazing technologies being developed, there's some interesting new business models where people are with a very social focus of new ways of looking at things.
Well, there's a moment in the book which reminded me very much of that oft-quoted sequence from The Graduate where Dustin Hoffman is advised to get into plastics. Well, thank you very much for all of that. But, and I thought the equivalent today might be ball bearings. You talk a little bit about them. And you say why?
And it's a very interesting example because it is a nuts and bolts revolution in that sense. And the story is that there was a green investment one I spoke to who just made a major play into ball bearings. And I thought, what's that about? And they said wind farms. I mean, wind turbines, they had lots of ball bearings. This company's a huge supplier of ball bearings to wind turbine manufacturers, and they're booming. And so we kind of think of this as being kind of almost esoteric, whereas actually like this is just an engineering challenge in lots of ways, and that's where I think lots of the opportunities also lie.
And if you think back to when another period of great demand for ball bearings erupted, it was World War II. I mean, you use the war metaphor in the book, but you see it, I think, rather differently. You're not talking about World War III, you're talking about a war to bring down global temperatures.
Yeah, no, correct. And work I did with Jürgen Randers on what that would look like. We called the 1 degree war plan, which features in the book, and it shows, you know, in a practical, economic, technical, engineering sense that we can do this quite easily. We can eliminate CO2 emissions from the economy in 20 years without enormous costs relative to the problem of what we're facing otherwise. But also
talk a bit about the scale of the cost.
Yeah, so we're talking about kind of 10% of GDP thereabouts is what Jürgen sort of back of the envelope calculation was. I mean, this was not saying this was like a comprehensive plan, but it's like, you know, Jürgen had access to some very good analysis that looked into what the significant economic implications are, and it's quite manageable. I mean, a lot less than World War II, certainly, in terms of impact, dramatically so. But also World War II shows some great examples. I'll ask Paul to talk about that, because it was really interesting sort of social examples of how what we learned in that process as well.
Yeah, and I think because some of the lessons from the World War II are the purely the economic of how quickly a society can transform its economic infrastructure from producing one good to producing another. For example, the simple order from the US government 4 days after Pearl Harbor that Ford was to stop producing motor cars. They're no longer a car company. In fact, they now produce tanks and weaponry, and that sort of rapid economic transformation. But also, as Paul said, the huge social transformation and the lesson from World War II and all sorts of other experiences that humanity's gone through collectively. Currently, Fukushima in Japan is another example of a real social upheaval at a time of crisis, but also of real social bonding and new bonds, new solidarities between people which come at that time of crisis. And we saw in the UK in World War II, for example, that despite huge political challenges, there was actually a coming together of the people. And some of the examples of that were that the huge rise in equality during the war and the huge benefits in terms of health, public health, and public togetherness that were a product of that, of those truly horrific circumstances. Let's not play that down.
I mean, democracy in the end, or democracies, came out reasonably well from the Second World War, but democracy went to the wall to some degree through those sort of 5 years. If you think about the political leadership and direction, I mean, you mentioned what happened to Detroit and Ford in particular. And you're talking about very short timescales, 5 years to get this started, getting 1,000 coal-fired power plants out of commission, and a bunch of other things, stranding or grounding half of the world fleet of aircraft. How's this going to happen?
It has to only happen, it can only happen in a crisis. So I guess the kind of way we think about that is that we're in a crisis now. The reality is, we look back on 2010, 2011, you know, our children, in fact us actually, because it won't be that far away, will say, what were we thinking? It was so obvious at that point. But so that's not the issue, is how much more we physically change or how much more physical crises we see.
And that's why you quote Winston Churchill as seeing it in 1936 when very few other people could.
And it seems devastating. I mean, if you were in 1936 and talked about the World War II, you would think that was the end of civilization, the end of democracy, the end of the world as we know it. And it was horrific. I mean, a whole range of ways that we know too well. But the point is, we went through that period, and that's why I think it's a very good analogy for what we're facing, is that we can get through this. We know what it looks like. It looks horrific and overwhelming and depressing when you face that, the unnecessariness. And that was unnecessary. We didn't need to get to here, but we have. And therefore, how you get through that becomes the kind of next challenge. And humanity is very clever at doing that.
And I think, and Paul talks a lot about this in the book, is that one of our responses to the crisis will be this, where World War II is an analogy of this massive government intervention and huge business change driven by that. But that was a temporary crisis. What we're facing here is actually something quite fundamentally different, where we're entering a prolonged challenge and a need to find new models for doing things, not for a 5-year time frame, but for a multi-decade time frame.